Okay, let's dive into something that sounds like it's straight out of a political thriller. In January 2026, the world was absolutely riveted when U.S. Special Forces launched a raid right into the heart of Venezuela. We're going to break down Operation Absolute Resolve, an event that, honestly, changed the game for global power dynamics.
So picture this. In a move that completely stunned the international community, U.S. Special Forces descend on Caracas. And their target, the country's sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, along with his wife, Celia Flores. They're captured and flown right out of the country. I mean, just wild.
And make no mistake, this was not some small, quiet mission. The operation, which was codenamed Absolute Resolve, involved a massive force. We're talking 150 aircraft from the U.S. Navy, Air Force, and the Marine Corps, all providing cover for the Special Forces on the ground.
The raid itself was unbelievably fast. The whole thing was over in just 30 minutes. But that incredible speed, well, it came at a pretty high price. We're looking at 55 Venezuelan and Cuban military and security personnel killed, plus 2 civilians. On the U.S. side, 7 soldiers were injured.
So the big question is, how on earth did an operation this huge and this risky actually happen in the capital of a sovereign nation? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of the strike itself.
Well, it was a seriously coordinated effort, a real multi-agency dance. First, you had the CIA providing that all-important on-the-ground intelligence. Next, elite Delta Force soldiers were flown into Caracas by the legendary 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. And then, to top it all off, FBI personnel, including their hostage rescue team, were right there on site to make the formal arrest.
Okay, so you've just captured a sitting head of state. How do you explain that to the world? Well, as you can probably guess, 2 very, very different stories started to emerge almost immediately. Officially, the White House was very clear. This was not an act of war. Instead, they framed it as a law enforcement action. The whole legal foundation for the raid was a U.S. federal indictment against Maduro and his wife for narco-terrorism. Essentially, they were just arresting wanted fugitives.
But, as you can imagine, Venezuela saw things a little differently. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez went on national television almost immediately, calling it a kidnapping, an act of imperialist aggression aimed at stealing the country's resources.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because beyond that official indictment, the U.S. administration was surprisingly open about another motive, getting access to Venezuela's oil. You know, just the largest proven reserves on the entire planet.
So, with such a shocking move and these 2 completely opposite narratives, the global reaction was, you guessed it, immediate, intense, and really, really polarized.
Right out of the gate, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres sounded the alarm. He was deeply concerned, saying that this set a dangerous precedent, and that, as far as he was concerned, the rules of international law have not been respected.
And he wasn't the only one. That feeling was echoed all over, including by the New York Times editorial board. They didn't mince words, calling the attack latter-day imperialism and saying it was both dangerous and illegal.
But, when you get down to the street level, the picture gets way more complicated. Of course, Maduro's supporters protested, both in Caracas and even in Times Square. But you also had members of the Venezuelan diaspora in places like Santiago and New York who were out there celebrating, hoping this was the beginning of the end of a long crisis. Now, to really get a handle on just how significant this all is, we have to zoom out and look at the history here. An event like this doesn't just happen in a vacuum. See, the 2026 strike in Caracas is really just the latest chapter in a long, and let's be honest, very complicated history of U.S. military intervention in Latin America. You can draw a line from Guatemala in 1954 to Cuba in 61, to the invasion of Panama in 1989 that nabbed Manuel Noriega, right up to today. And at the absolute center of Venezuela's modern story is one thing: oil. The country's economy is almost totally dependent on it. Get this, by 2012, oil accounted for a staggering 96% of the country's exports, and almost half of all its government revenue. I mean, that's both an incredible source of wealth and a massive vulnerability. It brings to mind this just chillingly accurate warning from one of Venezuela's own leaders. Way back in 1976, the guy who co-founded OPEC, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, basically predicted that the country's greatest treasure could one day be its curse. Talk about calling your shot. So all of this leads us to the biggest questions of all. With President Maduro gone, what's actually happening on the ground, and what on earth does this mean for Venezuela's future?
Well, the aftermath was probably not what most people were expecting, because while the president was gone, his entire government was still there. His vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as acting president, and this is the key part, the military recognized her authority. And all this instability has made those U.S. oil companies that were expected to flood in pretty hesitant to invest.
It's created this totally bizarre situation that one analyst just perfectly described as regime change without regime change. Think about that. The U.S. took out the leader, but not the government, leaving everything, the country's future and the U.S. strategy, completely up in the air.
And that's where we'll leave it, with a final, really provocative question for you to think about. In a world where one country can go into another and just arrest its leader, what does that mean for the future of international law, for national sovereignty, and for the basic rules of how the world works?